at a spot in time when things worked out their way. You know, they could have worked out another way.
I've had some interviews say something very similar, but to the fact that if you were over there, everybody did something heroic at one point or another, but a hero may only get recognized because he had so many.
Well, that part's true, and you might have done something heroic, but unknowingly. You did.
Absolutely.
You did really.
Like I said, we never meant to. We weren't doing something heroic to be heroic.
No.
We were doing what needed to be done for the particular moment.
That's right. I can recall some little incidents that kind of make me chuckle when I think about it. They weren't so funny. We were right on top of Hill 122, and there was a kind of a stone fence or a stone wall there, and I happened to see, peering over it, I happened to see what I obviously recognized as the comic section from a United States newspaper. And I jumped over that wall to get that comic section. It was shortly after that, then the Germans sent a lot of mortars in on us, you know. But that's the kind of dumb things that you do. And also when this particular area where we were, there were some split trenches already dug, and naturally we jumped right into those. And the first thing you know, they sent in a barrage of these. I think theirs were 80-millimeter mortars, the Germans. But anyway, I hear this guy yelling, "You're in my slit trench, you're in my slit." He pitched headlong into me, and he was just full of holes, you know. And I think before I got him off me and rolled him over and laid him in the slit trench, he was probably dead. And then we got orders to pull back. We were up on top of a quarry on Hill 122. We got orders to pull back down into the quarry, which we were glad to do, because it gave us a little bit more protection. But those kinds of things you see, and there's no rhyme or reason why he got wounded there and I didn't, you know. It was just an accident of timing and that sort of thing.
Let's talk about when you first arrived on D-Day as elements of the
well, the interesting thing was we got on. We were on the LCIs, Landing Craft Infantry, which held a company, and of course they were built so they had a gangplank on either side of the prow of the boat. Theoretically, go up to land and just run down, not even get your feet wet, you know. And the interesting to me was as we marched to get onto the boat, man, they handed each of us, I think, a carton or 2 cartons of cigarettes and chewing gum and candy and all that sort of thing, you know. And they're talking about lung cancer today. Well, back then the government was inducing us to smoke by giving us all these free cigarettes. That was part of the times. And but anyway, we thought we were going to leave to go. The D-Day was going to be on the 5th, but it was canceled, and then it was the next day, and we let out. It was, of course, dark when we let out. And when we got over near the coast of France, you could hear rumblings and things, and our time to debark and get into shore was not under our control. And we were out there, and on one side of us was the battleship Nevada and the cruiser Tuscaloosa on the other side. And of course we're greenhorns, and when both of those outfits left out with a salvo of shells, we swore that we'd been hit by a torpedo, you know, because the sides of that little LCI went like that, you know. But in any event, we had to get off on the Higgins boats to make the landing. The waters were a little too rough, I guess, for the LCIs to get in there. And you never saw such an agglomeration of a conglomeration of ships and vessels as far as the eye could see. You know, just the English Channel was just black with ships of all kinds, and they had destroyers going parallel to the shore, and they were firing into German entrenchments and what have you. Of course, we're down around Utah Beach, and we couldn't see up necessarily what was going on at Omaha Beach or the English and Canadians further up. But we knew that they were peppering the shores pretty well. And eventually then we had to go off the LCI into a Higgins boat. They had these cargo nets, and you had to go down the cargo net and then wait time to you jump into the Higgins boats so that you didn't knock your brains out. You know, you're going down and the boat's coming up, you know, that sort of thing. But we all get in, I guess you get maybe 30 men with their gear on into to one of those Higgins boats. And then we get up probably within, I don't know, maybe 300 yards. And the guy let the front end of it down, and off we went onto Utah Beach. In the meantime, of course, a number of the other units had already gone ashore ahead of us, and the engineers had done a good job clearing pathways through the mines, the minefields, and we just went on inland. We weren't seeing a heck of a lot of opposition of any kind, you know, where we were. And I think we got into kind of a farming area. We had to go across a causeway, kind of, and the Germans had flooded all the fields around there, you know. But anyway, we made it through the causeway. We got up on the little higher ground and got onto a farm, and that's where we parked over for the first night. But you could see, like, looking back out toward the channel, you could see, like, the town of Monteburg was burning, and it was flames leaping all over the place, you know. And then these little Frenchmen coming out of the woods and the nooks and crannies, and they're singing their Marseillaise, you know. And actually, when we first hit the beach and came through the dunes, the first prisoners that were there were one was a great big Italian. He must have weighed 300 pounds. And there were 2 Italians. And they had been used as engineering or pioneer troops, they called them, by the Germans. They were tickled to death to be prisoners, you know. And then, you know, the first real dead guy that we saw was a German. And the ducks, or the half, what are they? They might have been a tank, ran over the guy and had him pretty well ground into the mud there. And then that's when it comes home to you. Hey, this is for real, you know.
Yeah, about to say, when you see that first person that's dead, that's got to be an eye-opener.
Right. And the next morning we went on. Then we had to go down to a kind of a road junction. There was a manor house there with a big wall around it, and that was the point we were supposed to go to. And there was a little bit of opposition from it. And we were such greenhorns, from the captain and right on down to the least private, that they weren't showing very good tactics about what we did. But anyway, we finally made it down there, and there were a number of dead Germans there. And they just didn't look real. They looked almost artificial, you know. And there was a horse barn out there, and there were dead Germans and wounded Germans in there. And in that same area, a few of our paratroopers had been caught in the trees and shot, you know, by the Germans. And anyway, the real hard fighting for us came about in Normandy, you know, after we got in, and it was very slow moving. If you gained a couple of 100 yards in a day, you were doing pretty good. And as you know, the hedgerows were the big obstacle, and it was perfect for the defense, because they had these small fields, and the Germans would have a machine gun there and a machine gun there, and they got the crossfire over those fields. You try to go through the field, you know, and they got you. And getting through that hedgerow was just almost an impenetrable obstacle, until some bright GIs, I don't know, in the engineers or where they were, but they devised, you know, kind of a prong that they could lift up, go into like a bulldozer, but with a sharp teeth on it. And they could open holes in those hedgerows. Some of them were pretty thick, but anyway, that proved to be beneficial to a large extent to keep guys from being exposed without any kind of cover. And then I guess the big battle for us there was Hill 122. And for a short time while we were up there, we were surrounded, our battalion. And our battalion commander was a guy known as Fireball Pond, Captain Leroy Fireball Pond. By that time, I think he was a major. They had made him battalion commander, and he later became a lieutenant colonel. And he was an authentic hero in my book because he exposed himself to all of the dangers, that goes with being an infantryman, and particularly if you're an officer. I mean, he wasn't hiding down, he was standing up and giving directions. And you may have heard of Jim Flowers with the 712th Tank Battalion. He got word to try to break this hold that the Germans had. They had our battalion surrounded, and it was through the course of that action that he was wounded very badly there. And are you familiar with Henri Levauve? A few years ago, I guess it was at the 50th anniversary of D-Day, I took part of my wife and I were on that one, and maybe it was the year 2000. We went over there 2000 also. But Henri took us up on Hill 122, and he took us to the spot where Jim Flowers' tank had been blown up, and there's still metal fragments in the ground there, and it's amazing he ever came out of that thing alive. And the interesting thing to me was being up on Hill 122, Henri Levauve and his wife and a couple other couples from around town. In my group, we had a picnic up on Hill 122, right at the base of that rock quarry that I was telling you about. Well, the quarry had been all mined out by then, and the base of it was formed a lake. It was no good for swimming, but they did boating and fishing in there, And they had, where there had been barricades and all kinds of things, they had swings and slides for kids, And it just was so different from when we had been over there in 44. And a number of our fellows got badly wounded and killed up on 122. And but once that breakthrough was made, it was shortly before the big breakthrough at St. Lo. But I think this was taking of Hill 122 was a key point in the battle for Normandy. And when the breakout came, when they had, I guess they came over, I don't know, must have been a couple thousand bombers dropping bombs down in this St. Lo area. And you may know, or maybe you don't know, that Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, who was in charge of all the ground forces in Europe, was over to observe. He got killed at that thing. Somehow or other their bombing line came down on the American troops, and they were bombed there. But once that opened up, then the Third Army was formed right at that time, and we became part of the Third Army. And we swept down through Gavre and Avranches, and we went over through Rennes to Le Mans, and then, by golly, they sent us up to what became known as the Falaise Gap. And this big buddy of mine, when we just left on the outskirts of Le Mans, and we were trying to find out from our lieutenants and captains, what's up there? What are we going to? Oh, they said there's a couple of squads of Germans up there with some anti-aircraft guns, And sure enough, they began shooting these 20 millimeters, and George Kubit, my real close buddy, he dove to hit the ground, and when he did, a couple of them burst between his arms, and he was loaded. He was a big man, and when they picked him up, they put him onto a Jeep, which was rigged to be a stretcher-bearing Jeep, Man, the blood was pouring out of him. I thought, my God, will I ever see that fella again? And he recovered. They never did take all of the shrapnel out from him, but later on, during the Battle of the Bulge, he had been back with us for quite some time. He was my squad leader, George Kuba, and he had been back with us for some time, and it was snow up to your buttocks, and colder than bejesus. And we had been sitting around talking, and George said, well, I got to go up to the CP. And he had an M1 rifle. And so he was going more like what they would call trail arms. You your strap is loose, and he's got it by the muzzle, and he got up there, and I guess somehow or other, the sling of the rifle got caught in a bush, and unthinkingly he put his thumb over the end of the barrel and gave it a jerk to pull it loose. Well, the safety was off, or somehow it was disengaged, and it blew his thumb off, you know. So look at me, he said, blood coming up here. Anyway, they sent him back to the aid station, but immediately they put a yellow tag on him, SIW, self-inflicted wound. And that's what they did with guys that shot themselves. You know, he didn't say, he told them I shot myself, you know. And, but he said they put him just like the third degree, put him in a room, and they had these, CID, the Criminal Investigation Division, they grilled him about how he did it and why it happened and all this. They had that, one of these lamps that hang down, you know.
Like with him in the middle of a room.
Yeah, right. And so anyway, I finally had to give a statement as to what happened, and then they put him back into the regular stream of wounded soldiers, you know.
How interesting.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I mean, since the wars happened, there's been lots of debate over, you know, SIWs, and yeah, I've never heard a story quite like that. I've heard, you know, about the investigation with Light. I've never heard that. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and well, we had another fellow with us, and he had a nickname. I forget what his first name was now. His last name was Mooney. And when we were still in the States, you know, on guard duty, you had to know the password to get back in and all that. So old Mooney came up to this guard post, and the soldier said to him there, he said, advance and be recognized. So old Mooney came, who goes there? He says, it's me Mooney. I still die laughing when I think about it. He didn't know the password. He told him it's me Mooney, so that's going to answer all the questions. Anyway, just about the time I can connect it with the attempt on Adolf Hitler's life, and we were in the area there where kind of nothing was going on. It was miserable there and muddy, and so when you had a defecate or something, you found a hole, and you did, you know. So I jumped over this I guess you'd call it a hedgerow there, and I was going to relieve myself, and there's old Mooney down there, and he's relieving himself, you know. And I saw he had a 45 in his hip pocket, and I didn't pay any attention, and he was mumbling and going. I said to him jokingly to him, I said, Mooney, if I felt the way you do, I think I'd just shoot myself and get the hell out of here. I jumped back over the hedgerow to where my little slit trench was. And first thing you know, where pow! What happened was he had that 45 in his hip pocket. He went to pull his drawers up, and it fell out in the mud. So he was cleaning it off, and he shot himself through the foot. And he never came back to the op. I saw him later, and they put him, I don't know, he was in the transportation corps or something, driving a truck. But that was old me Mooney. And but we advanced sporadically. You know, we made some good gains, and getting out of Normandy was quite an achievement, I think, and going back up to the Falaise Gap.
Let's talk a little bit about your Normandy combat. As far as you explained about the hedgerows and the dividedness of the field.
Yeah.
As a heavy weapons company, as a mortar platoon,
right.
What were your duties? What did you do, and how did you support your fellow infantry?
Well, basically, as I said, you know, with each company there would be a forward observer and a radio man, and if they needed support from the 81 millimeter mortars, the forward observer, the lieutenant, would give me the instructions, and I'd radio back to where our people had the mortar set up, you know, and would fire one round, maybe a smoke round, to see where it was going to land. And then the lieutenant, he had glasses and all, he'd give me some instructions such as right deflection or left deflection, up elevation, down elevation, and, you know, repeating numbers to it. And then I would call those back, and then...
So you weren't necessarily back with the mortar crews. You were always up front on the front lines with your observer.
A good bit of the time, not always. I mean, different times, I mean, we would switch off and send somebody else up there, you know. But I had my share of it. And so I was with the rifle companies, and I remember one Captain Gormley. He was, I can't remember now whether he was A, B, or C company. He was one of the company commanders, but anyway. And he was quite a sport, and he was having problems there, and what was sustaining him, he had a bottle of gin and chocolate bars. He wasn't getting drunk or anything, but I guess it calmed his nerves, you know. And but yeah, we, and then of course, we also would radio back for the medics. And I can't remember now, it wasn't really a code, but it was a cute way of saying things that the people that I was calling would understand. I'd say, send some of Ravito's men. Ravito was maybe one of the surgeons with the battalion aid station, and they would send men up with stretcher bearers. And if you were in a place where you could bring in a Jeep would come up with a couple of stretchers on one side or the other, and they would strap guys on there and haul them back to the aid station. And but the
what was the difference in the fighting, like you said, for the breakout? You were talking about the hedgerows going back and forth, and
yeah.
You explained how you helped support the infantry and work directly with them. What was that fighting was slow, 100 yards by
That's right.
How did that change for you?
It changed dramatically because we were going miles and miles and miles in a day, where we were creeping along in yards before that. And as I said, we got to Le Mans, and then we circled back up, and my company was at a little place called Le Bourg St. Leonard, and that place changed hands about 3 or 4 times. And Colonel Pond, our battalion commander, was a real stick out there. And over at Chambois, I don't know whether you knew Waters, Laughlin Waters. He met up over there. He was with G Company, and he met up with the Poles, and that closed the gap, technically. And I guess the Pole had German prisoners he wanted us to take, and we had prisoners we wanted them to take. But the interesting thing about that area up there, they were trying bitterly, fierce fighting up there to get out of that pocket, the Germans were. And as I said, this little town of Le Bourg St. Leonard changed hands, I said, at least 3 or 4 times. And C Company, our C Company was captured up there by the Germans. And I can't remember which, it was not the commanding general, but which general it was that came up there, along with Colonel Pond. And they directed the battle right there in the town, you know.
That'd have been General McLean.
No, it wasn't McLean. He was the division commander.
Oh.
This was assistant division. I don't know, it was Buck Weaver, I think it's what.
Bill Weaver.
Yeah, I think it was Weaver.
William G. Weaver.
And he had his riding crop, you know, and he was pointing to the German tanks for our 712th Tank Battalion to blast them, you know. And it was successful, you know. We finally won the town back again.
What was that like to have, like you said, Leroy Pond, he made it all the way.
Well, he was, no, he got killed.
When was he killed?
Well, over in the town of Dillingen, across the Saar River.
That's right.
As a matter of fact,
what was it like to serve under?
Well, it was inspirational, you know, and you felt like here's guys that really know what the heck they're doing, and you know, and they're trying to protect us too, you know, they're to shield us as much as they could.
You know, can I get you to say that, including his name?
About Colonel Pond, yes. I'd be glad to say it.
Yeah, just if you could put his name and say that he's interested.
Well, as I was saying to you, Leroy Fireball Pond was a lieutenant colonel, I think, by this time, and his service amongst us was inspirational. and gave us really hope and some expectation that somebody was looking out for our good. And he exposed himself to enemy fire on many occasions when he didn't have to. And some of these fellows would never get out of the CP, you know, but he did. And then that Buck Weaver being up there too was quite an eye-opener for a lot of us. And actually, you know, we had that place, Valley's Gap was ringed around. On our side were the Americans, on the other side were Canadians and French and some Polish, and they dropped Polish paratroopers down in that maelstrom there. And we had every kind of a heavy weapon. I'm not talking about just mortars and machine guns, but artillery and everything else, ringing, tanks shooting down into that valley. I don't know who was coordinating the fire, but down there the Germans would form up convoys of vehicles and horses and horse-drawn equipment and all that sort of thing. And then the Americans would open up on them on one end, and the Germans, I mean the Canadians and the British, and work toward the middle end. You'd see these guys in flames jumping off trucks and vehicles. And at night, they would crawl up out of there. You might wake up and there's a German laying right beside you. They wanted to get out of there so badly. And when the battle finally ended, you know, and the big surrender came, I think the 90th took 18 or 19,000 prisoners there. And they were stunned. You could see it. They were just goggle-eyed.
For people that may not imagine, what did the Falaise Gap look like? What was it? Had you ever seen anything like that in your whole existence of the combat?
No, no, really hadn't. And the most pitiful thing is you hear those horses scream when they get hit. You know, they're even more than their voices are even more intense than humans. And the Germans used a lot of horses for horse-drawn artillery. And the other thing, I guess they were short of mechanical equipment, so they did the next best thing. And just hundreds and hundreds of those poor old horses got slaughtered. And we weren't trying to kill the horses necessarily, you know, but you had nothing you could do about it. The other interesting thing is, I think I was mentioning this to Henri Leboeuf not too long ago, right up near Le Bourg-Saint-Léonard, this town that I was talking about, there was a French government horse breeding farm, the Percherons. If you ever heard of Percherons, the big workhorses, they bred them there. And part of our operation took those animals to safety so they wouldn't get killed, you know, take them out of harm's way. I thought that was remarkable. And also in Normandy, we had men in our division who went on horseback, and they were assigned to round up the livestock and to get them pulled away from, you know, and that was another tragic thing when you'd be lying in those, the battlefields, these poor cattle would get wounded and they'd be down. By the next morning, they're up, you know, they swell up like that, and then they burst open and the stench will get you, you know that. And anyway, they tried very vigorously to preserve as much of the livestock for the French, and I think the French appreciated that even to this day, and to keep them.
Let's talk about that when you hit the beaches and you start liberating some of those towns. What was your reception by the French?
Great. they were the only bad thing about it was that we'd be coming along after we in the breakthrough areas, and they would throw these apples up, hit you in the head with an apple. You're going 25, 30 miles an hour, like to crown you, you know. And many things were kind of touching or.
Hold on just a
Yeah.
second. Okay, so we were talking about the Falaise Gap
Yeah.
and the destruction there. You'd never really seen anything quite like that.
That's for sure. And after that, you know, well, number one, General Bradley had different ideas than General Patton. Patton wanted to really pursue the Germans, and Bradley put a halt to that. Later, we had to fight those guys in the Battle of the Bulge because enough of them got away that they could serve as the nucleus for the forces that were arrayed against us in the Battle of the Bulge.
So after that, you have a little bit of time off because you run out of gas. Why don't you talk?
Well, what happened, yeah, we didn't get to go through Paris. We went around Paris, and we went up to Reims, where the Reims Cathedral is, and the Champagne country. Now, we were able to get a few bottles of champagne up in there, and the people there treated us real well. They were really happy to see us, you know. And beyond there, we get into some of the old battlefields from World War I, near like Chateau Thierry, where the Americans fought, and near, pardon?
Verdun and
yeah, Verdun, yeah, and those. As a matter of fact, the interesting thing too, you go by some of these farm fields where there was highway, and you see stacks of old shells from World War I. They were still turning up, and they put them out by the roadside. I guess they wouldn't explode, but there's some chance they would. But here it was. This is 1944, and World War I was over in 1918. That's 26 years later, and these farmers are still turning up shells from World War I. And then we moved up near Metz, and we had run out of gas and all that, and we got word, well, we're going to probably dig in here for the winter. It didn't make much sense to us, and I didn't think General Patton was going to stand for that. But in any event, I can't remember this particular lieutenant's name, but he was our platoon leader, and he was a replacement and a kind of a cocky guy. And we were out on a nice macadam road, you know, an asphalt road, and going up, and not any opposition, but for some reason he decided we had to get off the road and go through this pasture land and come up around to a high point and set up our weapons, our mortars and so forth. We get into this draw there that we were going through, and we saw these cattle lying there with their legs, a leg or two legs blown off, you know. And it's obvious what happened. They stepped on some kind of mine. And man, I tell you, we didn't want to go through there, but you got an order to go, and he's up ahead of us, so we went. And every so often you would see, you could tell someone had hurriedly done something to the ground, because there were boards that were too regular to have been anything but something improvised. What do they call them now in this? Some kind of explosive. Anyway, we had this Sergeant Schweitzer was a squad leader in our platoon, and a good guy, and so he was helping one of his privates there who was a little weary. He put his base plate on to carry it for him, and he stepped on one of those boards, and it just blew him to pieces. And pieces of his flesh got all over us, you know. We didn't get any of the shrapnel. What they had in there, I don't know whether they were 1 or 2 88 shells, but they were set so that they could be detonated by pressure putting on them from above. And that's what he stepped on, blew his arms and legs off. Just, it was a mess.
Well, I would imagine so. Now, as you get past, you know, get into where you run out of gas and you're kind of sitting through September and October, and you're having a little bit of slow going before you get into
the Moselle, right.
You're down in...
we were near Gravelotte.
Gravelotte, that's it.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
And in Mézeres-les-Metz, but we were on the outskirts, my outfit was, of those areas, but the infantry companies were, you know, fought in there, and they had some brutal battles to take over those towns.
Oh, absolutely.
And
what was your experience like, or set up and give us a little bit of your take on that Moselle River crossing?
well, yeah, my recollection is that, let's see, that was in November, and we crossed that river. Our outfit crossed on the 9th. I think it was the 9th of November. But of course, it was, for us, it was a night operation. And I can't remember, we set out maybe like midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. And we come up over this hill and then down toward the river valley. And when we got down there, the little boats had not, the combat boats, you know, had not arrived. So there was a barn there, an open-air barn. It was roofed over, but I mean the sides were open. And it was all full of hay, so we all got ourselves warm by burrowing into the hay and waiting for the engineers to come up with the combat boats. And they finally did. And you know, the Moselle was flooding at that time. And of course, we were all trying to be quiet and very silent. And when the trucks came and dropped those boats off, they made a little bit of noise. But fortunately, we were able to, you know, I think they had, I don't remember, it was 8 or 12 men that they took. But you also had an engineer on the front and an engineer on the back. He acted as a tiller, the engineer in the back, and we did we pulled the oars as the propelling force, and so we got across all right, and
Now you crossed with the 359th. That would have been up north on the northern crossing side.
Yeah.
Near Malling.
Near what?
Malling?
Yeah, yeah. And well, we finally made our way up on top of, I don't know whether it's a mountain or whatever you want to call it, but you could look back down to the river, and our engineers were trying to put up pontoon bridges, you know, and they would line them up along the shore, and then they had a motorboat that would pull it out to the other shore, and they'd get that thing, and then the Germans would blow them out of the water, you know, and then they'd do it all over again. And of course, they had smoke pots going down there, but even so, the Germans had it zeroed in for that area. But they finally got some, you know, pontoon bridges in there to enable heavy armor and trucks and jeeps to get across. And then I remember the morning of I can't remember, it was 358 or 357, were attacking that Fort Königsmacher, huh?
358.
358. And that morning, it was just about daybreak. You never saw so many tracer bullets in your life. We were up, and actually we were in a log dugout that the Germans had dug up there. We dugout they had prepared, and we used that for ourselves, you know. And but we could get a panoramic view of everything that was going on. And it was just, it's like watching a movie there with all the tracer bullets arcing across the sky. And any event, we moved on from there to the Saar River Valley.
Now, by this point, mid-November, you've been in combat for a good 3 months.
More than that, yeah.
Yeah, November. Yeah,
July,
June 6th,
August,
June 6th
September,
to November
October.
6th, yeah, it's
Yeah.
3-4 months. And,
Yeah.
And is it surprising to you? Now, by this point, you have seen, and probably only you, have seen an enormous amount of turnover.
Oh, yeah.
Were you one of the only original company members by that point?
No, I mean, there were several others, but I do remember this one fellow that came in as a replacement, and he got wounded. Then he came back, and I'm the only guy he knew, you know. And he got wounded a second time and came back, and I was still the only guy he knew, you know. And I got a kick out of that. It wasn't funny. It was kind of a grotesque humor, but he said, I don't know anybody but you. He said, how come you're not getting shot? I said, I guess I'm just lucky, or the Lord has some other work for me to do, you know. And
did you think about that quite a bit as you, like I say, as you go on as being an infantryman, seeing how much turnover you had throughout your whole regiment?
Yeah.
Did it begin to become surprising, or did you begin to think, well, is my time coming, or did that really never cross your mind?
Well, part of that, yeah. I never dwelt on that very much, and but now that you mention that, I recall, you may not remember this woman, Claire Booth Luce. Her husband was the head man of Time and Life and Fortune, and she was a congresswoman at that time, and she made a trip over to France and so forth, and interviewed a lot of GIs, and she said, well, the only thing these fellows have to look forward to is either getting wounded or getting killed. there's no program to give them, time off or R&R, whatever you want to call it, And they did introduce some small program. Every once in a while, a guy from our outfit would be sent back to the States for 30 days, R&R. But it was through her efforts that they did that. And I always thought very highly of her because of that. And but you thought about those things, and I don't know that I had a particularly strong religious bent, but I had a certain religious bent, and I had. I've often mentioned this. I had Rock of Ages. I had that memorized, and that would be one of the things that I would repeat to myself as different situations would crop up. And then there were a couple of, the Army had a pretty good system there. I don't know how well organized it was, but periodically we would get a case of, let's say, literature. It'd be magazines and books and what have you, by the Armed Forces printing house or whatever it was. And I remember getting a book that had some short poems in there that related to our situation. And some of it was written kind of in an old English style. It was by English poet. And the title of it was "Say Not That Struggle Not Availeth," not, N-A-U-G-H-T, And I would recite that to myself, and it would give you a little confidence that you weren't there alone, that there were other people involved. And one of the lines went something like, if hopes were dupes, fears may be liars. It may be in yon smoke concealed, your comrades chase even now the flyers, and but for you possess the field. See, so I may be holding the whole damn show up if I don't get up and do what the rest of the guys are doing. So that gave me some confidence and a lift to my spirits. And anyway,
well, that's good. No, it's interesting because so many times I think people, the histories of your units have been documented in the archives.
Yeah.
They're in the books. Not all of the history that's out there has been unearthed.
Right.
Or photographs or whatever. But the one thing that really you can't find very much about is really how you guys dealt with your day to day.
Yeah, that's right.
And because it's hard for anybody to imagine to put themselves in a place of, in Vietnam, you do the year of combat, but you knew if you could make it through that year, you were going.
You're right, yeah.
With you guys, you didn't know when.
No, that's right. That's very true.
I think a couple of veterans I've talked to, quite a few, almost considered themselves deceased before they even started. They figured,
that's right.
If I come back, I'll be lucky, but I've got to do what I've got to do.
You got to do what you have to do. That's right. But talking about the everyday life, you got to eat. And I thought one of the most inventive, ingenious articles that we had was the little can opener. We all wore them on our dog tag. And they came with one of the rations, I don't remember which. I think it came with, we never got these. They were for the tankers, the 5-in-1 and the artillery, 5-in-1, 10-in-1 rations. But every so often we'd borrow or beg one from those guys, and they had a little can opener in there. And you could open any kind of a can with it, So we had those, and what we would do with our K-ration box, the outside was kind of like a heavy manila paper, but the inside was heavy waxed, real heavy, so it'd keep things watertight, What we would do with that, we'd take our canteen cup, and we'd take our trench knife and connect through the handle of the canteen cup, push it into the bank of our slit trench or foxhole, wherever we were, and then we would we'd take one of the canned foods out of the K-ration. If it was breakfast, it was chopped eggs and ham, and we'd open that 3/4 of the way with a key, and hang that off of the cup. And in the cup we had hot water and powdered coffee. And then with that waxed carton, and would burn both of them. But that made hot enough fire, would boil that coffee for you, and also cook that can of eggs or can of, well, they had a little pork loaf with carrots and apple flakes. That was one of their little cans.
Well, you just haven't forgotten it. No. You always remember that.
I always remember it. And, but that was great. And with that, having that together, you could have a warm meal, you know, and hot coffee. But we had another guy with us, so he didn't believe in that. He carried a blowtorch. He'd fire that thing up, and he'd have he'd melt your cup if you let it there long enough, you know. And,
well, let's talk about about your next major engagement, which was some difficult fighting, which is when you finally reached the Siegfried Line for the first time.
You mean the Saar, in the Saar River, yeah. Well, that was another situation, you know, similar to the Moselle crossing that wasn't as flooded, but we got down to where we were making the river crossing, and again, we had the little combat boats, and you could look downriver and you could see there was a railroad bridge there, and we had to land upside of the railroad bridge because they said the Germans were there, and we had these two engineers. I said one guy was the tiller in the back, and the other guy, he was kind of, I don't know, a lookout or something, and when you'd get to where you were supposed to be, he'd jump off and hold the boat, you know. Anyway, the current was pretty swift, and we start out from shore there, and the first thing you know, the boat starts to go around like this and go down. So the man who's the tiller in the back hollers to the guy in front and said, "Hey, what's the matter? Don't you know how to..." No, the fellow in the front hollered to the man in the back, "Don't you know how to steer this thing?" "No, I've never been on one before." This is the engineer who's supposed to be the tiller. So that guy, now he was a hero in my book. He made his way from the front of that combat boat back there, got it under control. He didn't worry about the other fella. He just set him aside, and we got back to rowing that boat across the river. All of a sudden, we come to a quick halt. And I said, "We're in the middle of the river. We can't get out here." We hit on a sandbar in the middle of the river. And so we all had to jump out, and then we had galoshes on. You know what, man, they were a mess. And of course, that water and sand came into our shoes and into our galoshes, and we made our way across to the other side. And no sooner I got over there than the Germans are firing machine guns. And we had, each of us had 2 days K rations, and we had them stuffed down in our jackets and our shirts, you know. I remember hitting the deck there, and every one of those rations skittered out, and I said, "The hell with those." I didn't worry about it until we finally got to where we had some protection. We tried to dig in, and the hole would fill up with water. So talk about being miserable. We're sitting in mud, and machine gun bullets are going off. And
now, being the heart of the Siegfried Line, there were pillboxes.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to start to say. So we got down by the railroad embankment at that railroad bridge, and there were some Germans up there, and they popped some of their potato mashers down, but then some of our boys got rid of them, and we get up to the big row of houses. There were one house, they all had common walls in them, and those things, believe me or not, but they were almost like pillboxes themselves down on the lower, what we would call the cellar. And off to the right was a real, genuine big pillbox. And again, our C Company boys were sent over, and they took that pillbox away from the Germans, you know, with satchel charges, and they had the flamethrowers and all that. But then when they stayed inside and didn't have anyone outside to guard, you know, to be on guard duty, and the next night the Germans came back and took them prisoner. So then we were sent over there, but we of course kept the men out patrolling and so forth. And over in that area, we were over there. We never did get any equipment across that river. And, you know, and we get over there, I think it was around the 9th of December. And we captured these Germans. They kept telling us something big is going to happen. We said, well, the Germans are going to surrender and we're going to all go home for Christmas. That's what we thought, you know. And they couldn't tell us what it was, but something big was going to happen. Well, it's the Battle of the Bulge is going to start. And it was at this spot where Colonel Pond came over to view the action. And these row houses, you could look across to see these open fields where the Germans were. And I don't remember whether it was an artillery shell or a mortar shell. That's where he got fatally wounded. He lived for maybe 3 or 4 more weeks. He went to a hospital down in Thionville, France. The Germans called it Diedenhofen, Thionville. But anyway, that's the kind of a guy he was. And it was right, we were right in that row houses when he got that fatal wound. Then we had another little guy, Kenneth Evans, and I liked him a lot. He was a little lieutenant, first lieutenant. He was a second lieutenant when they came over, and they advanced him to first lieutenant. He was a school teacher from Michigan, and a heck of a nice guy. And he got shot in the ass with a rifle grenade by the Germans. And I think he lived for a little while, but not very long. And I sure hated to see that because he was really quite a guy. But
how, if you don't mind me asking, when you have and you lose a buddy like that, how did you deal with that?
There's not much you can do about it, you know.
Is it something you put aside? Did you mourn later?
Yeah, you have remorse and regrets, but you have to keep thinking positively and moving ahead. And I know then we later had to withdraw from where we were. When we were setting up the mortars, as a matter of fact, behind this row houses I mentioned, and we'd hardly gotten up into that area. And you know, they said, "Well, set up the mortars, and we can probably, you know, send some of you guys up front and see what we need to do with them." And while we were setting up the mortars, the base plate and the tripod, the bipod, and the tube, boy, those shells came from behind us and hit the building in front of us. And we were all knocked down to the ground and had shredded things in our clothing and all. But we ran into the basement. And then we could hear this guy saying, "I'm hit, I'm hit." "Well, come on, run in here." And he did. He ran in and he pitched headlong onto the cellar floor there. And he was dead. How he ever made it. His whole leg was shattered up here, you know, the thigh. And but he managed to run and pitched headlong. And so we were kind of living in that basement there. We couldn't have old Harold, you know, lying in there with us, so we put him out in a shed. And, you know, in order to get water at that particular time, we had to wait till nightfall, and there was a spring down there, and you could get out and get clean water there. So you couldn't get out hardly during the day. And the Germans, we'd knock a tank out, because we had nothing to stop them, but knock a tank out, and then they would come in at night with a tank retriever and haul it back and repair it, you know. But after we were there, I guess it was right after the Battle of the Bulge started, we got word to pull back across the river to a little town of Fitton. And when we got that word, we had prisoners, and we had, like, Harold, who was dead, and other wounded guys. We made the Germans carry our dead men and our wounded down to the river. And they did get a footbridge across, so we went across on the footbridge. And then we were in this little town of Fitton, and you could look across the river to see where we had been, and you could see these Germans, and they were doing just like we would do. Go out to take a crap, you know. Then we'd pepper shots at them, and but we also, in that little, the Germans had pulled all of the civilians out of this area, but they left their hogs and chickens and all that behind. So we had some good old farm boys there, and they got the one hog and they butchered him. And we had Arnold Johnson, a fellow from Chicago, was a butcher in civilian life. So he did the carving up, and we all pigged out on that pig and got sicker than hell with diarrhea, you know. dysentery. You couldn't, your stomach couldn't take it. But anyway, then shortly after that, we got word then to go up to the bulge.
Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and change tapes now.
Yeah, okay.
So that because this one's going to end, and that way we can continue with the bulge.
Okay.
Tell you what, I really enjoyed.
Pardon?
I said I'm really enjoying interviewing you. You're
Well,
a
good.
good interview. Very clear, very well spoken. You're a dream come true for guys like me. Especially if you've been through, you were all the way through. Like,
Yep.
I've only met 5 guys.
There weren't many.
that did it. Huh? That's a good one. Yeah.
Who's the best one?
Pardon me?
You want the best one?
The 5th one.
Oh, the best one.
Oh, the best one. Oh, well.
Do you know Jean-Pascal?
Jean-Pascal, living in...
Let me see.
Why don't you go ahead and pick up where you left off? You were double-crossing the SAR and moving up to the bulge.
Yeah, well, we went across and retreated and then went up to the Battle of the Bulge. And we got up, I think it was just kind of northeast of Bastogne. I forget the name of the town. And it was unbelievably cold, I'll tell you. And on our way up, of course, they had blackout lights on. You couldn't have your headlights on, these little cat's eyes. And little Reuben and I, one of our Jeep drivers, there were some curves on these mountainous roads, and his Jeep went over. He got killed there. And he was a little, I guess you'd call him Mexican or Chicanos or whatever they call him, but a heck of a nice little guy. And unfortunately, he got killed there. And we went up in the snow, was just hip deep in the area up there. And we saw this lineup of, it was the 9th Armored Division. They were strung along this highway, and they're all blown up. Tanks and half-tracks and jeeps and trucks. But the Americans had blown them up themselves to prevent them falling in the hands of the Germans. And then, but anyway, up to where we came face to face with the Germans, we saw some Sherman tanks coming over the crest of a hill. Oh, the boss said, there's our tanks up there. But then when you could get the broadside of them, here they had the swastika painted on it. They had our tanks that they were using. And it was obvious that it was a desperation move by Germany to do what they did, because they had flown big planes in, landed. They could never take off again, even under perfect conditions, bringing supplies in. And as I said, it was unbelievably cold. And we did, I can't remember the name of the little old town, but we were on the outskirts of town in like a farming area. We got into a nice, dry, clean, fairly warm basement. You know, we got out of that snow. And but we fought all up through there, and I know we were in Belgium, and then over into Luxembourg, and Burlay was a town that the 357 was actually the ones that captured the town, but we fought in that area. And when I was back there on the 60th anniversary, they had a big celebration in the town, and they were very good to us there.
Now, when you got up in there, the 90th was making kind of a knockout punch and kind of
That's right.
closing the southern salient, closing another gap.
That's right.
What was the difference, besides the weather, in this one? I mean, what were some, did you have any different types of problems? Because you were basically back on the Siegfried line, just a much...
That's right. Well, I forget now what the heck was the name of the town where we really crossed the Dragon's Teeth? And
Habscheid.
Habscheid. Yeah, Habscheid. Well, it was different in that where we were punching at the Germans, they were now retreating, you know. They were putting up good resistance and all that, but we knew we had them on the run. And
what did you think about the quality of your adversary?
I thought they were very good soldiers in general, you know, and hard fighters and well-trained. Toward the end, I mean, they had a lot of kids and things that weren't. But by and large, they were pretty well-trained, and I'm not talking about the Nazi-type guys like the SS and so forth, but the average German GI was a pretty good soldier, in my book. And there were a lot of things that were associated with brutality as far as the Germans were concerned. But I don't think it transcended every rank in the German army, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And
did you find at some point, or even later on, did you come to a belief that really the guy on the other side of the hedgerow, or the guy that was on the other side of the pillbox was basically just you from a...
Well, more or less, yeah. They were kind of in the same boat we were. You know, their countries tell them what they had to do, and we knew we had to whip them to get rid of Hitler and his scourge, you know, of the Nazi Party and the Nazi theories, and they're just a terrible aberration in the German population. And a lot of my people, heritage is German, even though I have an English name. And my one grandfather was English, but the rest of my other grandfather and both grandmothers were German, you know. And my mother, of course, was born in Germany, too. So it wasn't as though I didn't have some feeling for the Germans. But
All right, so let's finish. We can talk a little bit more about cracking the Siegfried Line in the north, and then moving on to the second Moselle River crossing.
yeah, I'm trying to think now. I did have a short stay in the hospital, and it was at the time of the second Moselle River crossing, so I missed that. But
Were you wounded, or?
No, I wasn't wounded, but I'm a pretty tall guy, and I had this continuing dysentery and diarrhea, and I was down to about 140 pounds and getting pretty weak, you know, and malnutrition and all that sort of thing. And I can't remember now, our aid man finally said, you got to go back to the aid station. I can't do it. We would get paregoric and bismuth and that sort of thing. And the original paregoric, which had an opium derivative in it, made you feel pretty good. But then they realized what they had there, and they had a synthesized opium. Anyway, make a long story short, I went back to the aid station. So the doctor there said, how long have you been here? I said, well, I've been here since D-Day. Hell, he said, you belong in the hospital. Oh, who am I to argue with the doctor? So they sent me back. They put me on a plane and sent me back to Paris. And I was in the American hospital in Paris. And, oh, and then I had scabies, if you know what scabies are. And of course, we were always louse-ridden, but when we had DDT, you could get rid of the lice like that. But the scabies get under your skin, you know. And so they plastered me up with some bituminous compound that evidently smothers them, you know. And they put me on a big bland diet and got me back, you know, to putting on a little weight and everything, and then they sent me back.
So when did you join back up with the 90s?
I'm trying to think now, whether it was the end of March, I think it was.
So they'd already crossed the Rhine at this point?
Yeah, well, I got there just after they crossed the Rhine, and we were in Mainz.
Okay.
Yeah. And then from there on, it was terrible devastation in Mainz and those cities around there. You know, the destruction was unbelievable, you know, from our bombing and the shelling and everything that went on. And then, but from the standpoint of fighting, it was more or less a cakewalk from there to the Czechoslovakia. We had some.
Yeah, you were moving pretty quickly in
Yeah,
the battles.
right.
Now, what about towards the end of the war, the 90th found the Merkers gold mines?
Right, well, that was 357.
Uh-huh. And now then also there was the liberation of the
Flossenburg, yeah.
Now, was your unit involved in that, or?
No, we were not. That was 358, I
Yeah,
think,
that's
and
what I thought.
Bill Falvey and
Yeah.
that group.
Yeah.
But I mean, we also saw other smaller camps, and,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
and we liberated some prison camps that had mostly English troops in them, and a few Americans, but mostly English. And some of those poor devils were captured down in Africa, you know, and they've been up there all those years, you know.
Wow. Now, towards the end of the war, you can really see that things are winding down. You're
Right.
at the Czechoslovakian border. Not really much Germany left to defend.
That's right.
And the Panzer Division, the 11th Panzer, decides that they're going to surrender. And
That's
now
right.
That was your unit.
That's right.
And so why don't you talk a little bit about that side?
Oh, you mean about the surrender of the 11th Panzer Division? Well, it was kind of a prosaic thing. As a matter of fact, we were so so sure of ourselves that we made the Germans patrol themselves. You know, and they surrendered. They wanted to surrender to the Americans, and they did very nicely. And we were in a little. I'm trying to think of the name of the little town we ended up in.
Versby?
Pardon?
The Versby, or even where the surrender was?
Oh, no. The town that we ended up was, it'll come to me, I forget it right now. But I met a girl there by the name of Beta Manova. She was as pretty as a picture, and blonde, you know, just as pretty as a picture. And we were camped on the farmland of a Czech family. And they had an interesting background. I can't remember their name now, but they had been living in Chicago. They had immigrated to the States, and they had a son and a daughter still in Chicago. And his parents or her parents died, and they came back to Czechoslovakia to claim their estate. And when they got back there, then they couldn't get back to the States, so they were stuck there. And they had another son who was born in Czechoslovakia. And that little old lady, she'd get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and bake us rolls and all that, the goodies. But they told us, you know, on the farm produce, about half of it had to go to the German forces. The other half they could live off if they could live, you know. And then, interestingly enough, this gentleman, I can't think of his name, but he had bricked up and cemented over what do you call them? Like a little room in the where do you hang clothes? What do you call it? A closet. I couldn't get the word closet. He had bricked this closet up, and while we were there, he got a pickaxe and he broke it open. He had a picture of Woodrow Wilson. He served in the United States Army in World War I. He had his discharge in a framed. And so then we were able to contact his son, who was with the 7th American Army. And we were able to put them in touch while we were there. And I got a kick out of that. But he had all these artifacts that he had hidden away. He didn't want the Germans to get at them, you know. And he was actually an American citizen. But that didn't cut in the ice.
Yeah, absolutely. So the war has now come to an end.
Yeah.
And it's May 7th, and you're getting your orders that they're probably going to sign a thing. And on May 8th, they tell you, guys,
Right.
put your bullets up. You, being in from the beginning, I guess you had pretty high points.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And so you were probably one of the first to go. What was that day when your platoon leader came in and told you, guys, it's over. It's officially over.
Well, you know, we knew it was over there. We were sitting out on a farm field, and we had the GI radio on, you know.
Oh, you already knew?
Yeah, we did.
So did he come in and tell you after you got...
Oh, yeah, they came and told us. All right.
Well, what was, when you first heard it, the first time that you heard that it was official, did you have any...
Well, I don't know, you know, whether I had any particular reaction or not. I mean, I guess I was glad it was over and that I'd be soon going home. And but we did notice one thing in these little Czech towns. They had built these triumphal arches, you know, out of pine boughs and what have you. But they were all facing from the other direction, welcoming the Russians, you know. And of course, we came in from the other side, and we were drawn back into Germany about another 20 miles into a little town called Hirschau. That's where my company was. Our regiment was in Hamburg, and the division was in Weiden. So we were occupying that area. And it took some little time before the points that got you home became effective. And anyone that was married got first priority. And if they had children, you know, they got first priority. But I didn't, because it was easy going for us then, and I didn't mind.
Well, you've been very candid with your talk about your combat experience and some of that stuff, and I want to talk to you a little bit about some issues a little kind of on a more personal level. Have you always been this open about your service, or was there a point in time when you didn't talk about it?
Well, you know, one thing, I think most guys are just like I am. They find it difficult to talk about combat to someone who's never experienced combat, because you're going to get questions that you can't answer and questions that
you don't want to answer.
Don't want to answer, yeah. And so anyway, I think the average guy, you know, when we get together in groups like this, we'll talk amongst ourselves, you know. And but most guys don't even tell their families, you know. And so it's although it's, I think this book of Greta, you know, the greatest generation, I think it's opened up a lot of dialogue with fellas who had been and had never said anything to their families, and I think I've seen evidence of that, you know. And of course, unfortunately, so many of them are dying off now. It used to be, I could count on at least 10 to 15 fellas from my platoon who would be here to the reunions. Now I'm the only one. In the last year, 5 of my closest buddies have died off. And oddly enough, out in the lobby of the area there, they have some things on the wall. I walked in, and the very first thing I spotted was this photograph on the wall. And I got over, took a little closer look at it, and the photograph was taken in 1960. It was the first reunion that I went to. It was in New York City, only one we ever had in New York City. Who's right in the middle of the picture? Myself and my two of my closest buddies.
Really? Could you put yourself out to me?
Oh yeah,
Because I would like to see if I get a scan. That would be a neat
yeah.
thing. And that's another thing I was going to ask you. Like you said, you seem to open up. Obviously, you'll open up more to your buddies, and you'll talk more about combat because you understand on the same level. But is there a side of you that wants to talk to people that don't know about it?
Well, the best or the biggest thing I have on my mind is leaving some kind of a record so that my kids know and understand. And,
have you talked with them very much about this?
Not very much, but I've been doing some writing, and I'm going to bequeath that to them.
Wonderful, wonderful.
And,
well, and of course, obviously, you'll now have the interview. Have you ever done an interview like this before?
No, I really haven't, although, you know, I went to Stephen Ambrose. He put up this D-Day Museum, so I was invited to attend the inauguration of that, and I think his name is Brinkley. David, is it David Brinkley? Yeah, anyway, he requested that since I couldn't do an interview there, they gave me a big questionnaire to fill out. And I don't think I ever did fill it out. But,
so is this one of the first times that I would imagine this would have been one of the first times that you've ever sat down?
This is the first time I've ever sat down. And the reason I said that, I mentioned to you before, a real good young friend of mine is over here with the Library of Congress, and they have a program like this going on. And so, because I'm not up in this area very often, and so he was going to get for me a kind of a questionnaire.
Yeah, the World War II questionnaire.
Yeah. And he asked me if I would fill it out, and he's very interested. He may be over here. No, he's coming over tomorrow.
Well, please have him come down.
I will.
Absolutely, and if he would like, if you don't mind, if he wants a copy, I'll send him a copy of your.
That would be great, because that would save me
from making the copy. I can just dub a couple of them.
The one thing I said to him, you know, he had asked me, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, if I would mind sitting down with a tape recorder and give some of my reminiscences and so forth. But I find it very difficult to do that. I can do it better if someone's throwing questions at me or asking like you were doing, you know, because then it evokes memories.
Well, I kind of ask guys this just to gauge it. how did you feel with our interview? Was it comfortable for you?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
All right. And do you feel that I asked you appropriate questions?
Yeah, I think you did, yes.
Okay, good. I'm always trying not to, I never want to get into any areas that the veterans don't want to talk about.
Yeah.
Of course, I want to know everything.
Of course.
I can sit and listen to you as detailed as you can get.
But I think some parts of it is your everyday living experiences under combat conditions where you exist on rations. And of course, the big ration at the start was the old sea ration from World War I. And you had a can of beef stew and a can of like beans, and then you had hash. And you could spot the cans by the colors, and the hash had a kind of a gold color to it with green printing on it. And all over Normandy, you'd see those things where tanks had run out. You couldn't eat them. You'd get so heartburn, and it was terrible. But now the stew and the beans were good, and when you got a day's ration of sea rations, you got 6 cans, one each of the 3 that I mentioned. Then the other 3 would have hardtack in them, and it would have maybe chewing gum and some powdered coffee and sugar cubes and that sort of thing. And so we could, we could take those things, and they were pretty good. And then, of course, the K ration, they tried to give you a little more variety than you got. But actually, it boiled down. You had a breakfast, a lunch, and a dinner K ration. And, I was told you the pork loaf with the carrots and apple flakes, that never left my mind. And then another one they had was a kind of a beef. And they were all pretty good, but you get a little tired of them after a while, too. But you take the biscuits that were in there, the hardtack that was in the K ration, if you could take one of them and put it in a cup of, about a half a cup of water, that thing would swell up to fill up that cup. So that's what it did in your stomach, made your stomach feel full, Then you could also tell who the manufacturer of the K rations were. The best, believe it or not, in my opinion, the best K rations were put out by Heinz, not only because I'm from Pittsburgh, but the H.J. Heinz Company. They always had a first-line cigarette. You either got Lucky Strikes, Campbell's, or Chesterfield. There was an outfit that had no connection with George Patton, the Patton out of Chicago. It was E.N., not O.N. They had Wings or Marvel cigarettes in them, and the candies weren't worth a darn. Now, in the Heinz ones, they had, they're famous Reeds.
Yeah, Reese's candy.
Yeah, and you had that in there, but the ones with the Patton were just not very good. And
I was going to ask you about, like we were talking about how a lot of the guys don't talk, and you've enjoyed talking about the daily experiences. What do you hope by sitting down and I want to donate I'm going to be donating all these interviews to an archive somewhere, maybe Library of Congress, maybe National Archives, whoever is willing to take it. But I've collected quite a few veteran interviews. What do you hope by you taking the time and sitting down here that people can learn in the future about your experience?
Well, you would hope it would lead to more peaceful relations in the world, but I don't think that's a realistic appraisal of what's going on. But that's what you'd hope for, that you don't want to have to see other young folks go through what we went through. To some extent, the experience made men out of us. We might not have become men if we hadn't been exposed to the rigors of combat life. But when you boil it all down, it doesn't seem to me that the world has advanced itself very much in terms of world peace. And, we see what's going on with Al-Qaeda, with the Muslim world, and that's all based on hate and animosity, the same as what Hitler fomented. But anyway, you would hope that they would get some experience of what it's like to be faced with a situation you can't do anything much about but do your duty. And that's why I think we talked about the average German soldier, the common fella. He was doing his duty. Not the guy that had the swastikas and all that crap, but the average guy, he did what he had to do, you know. And
what does it mean to you to be associated with the 90th Division? What does it mean to you personally to be?
well, it was some of the proudest moments of my life to be with him, because we did a good service, and we were become well recognized. We were derogated early on because of poor leadership at the top level. The McKelvey never should have been the division commander. And well, if you ever read the book From the Ground Up, it tells you the episodes about him. And then, of course, he called for an airstrike on our 357 and killed about 70 of our men in 357. And then I was trying to think, when he was out of, I think McLean came in.
No, it was Landrum came in.
Oh, Landrum came in. And he was better than McKelvey, but not a heck of a lot. When McLean came in, he kind of restored the values that we needed. And of course, Van Fleet was tops.
He was incredible, man.
Yeah, he was. Of course, then he ended up as head man in Korea later on, you know. Also, Truman sent him to Greece to keep the Greece from falling in the hands of the communists, you know. And
it's so nice to hear you guys get to tell your stories. To me, I enjoy it. I can listen to interview after interview after interview.
well, that's great, yeah.
And I've really enjoyed sitting down with you and listening to you. Is there anything else that you would like to talk about or mention quickly, or whatever that we haven't covered, or that I may have not asked you about, that you think would be something of importance or interest?
Well, not that I can think of off the top of my head. I mean, probably if we sat here, we could ramble long about a lot of other things, and then something else would pop up in my mind. But, you know, it always amazed me that for every guy that was on the front line, there were 13 in the rear echelon in order to service us on the front line, plus all of our folks back in the homeland. And we never wanted really for anything. I mean, food or ammunition. There were a few times, but and then some of the guys were black marketing our cigarettes and that sort of thing. And but no, I thought about the logistics of things and what a tremendous undertaking it was for the United States to send millions of men over to Europe to supply them with everything they needed, and yet to supply the Pacific, you know, and also help the Russians, and supply the Russians, and help Britain. So it was a mammoth undertaking, and we were all part of it. You know?
Well, my last question for you is there anything you would like to say about the men you served with and the buddies that never came home?
Well, yeah, the buddies that never came home, not much we could really do about that. I respected almost every one of them. And the other fellows that we served together, well, you know, I'm glad you mentioned it, because the Army, and I think many armies, have the so-called buddy system. And that's what makes war endurable, having a buddy that's going through the same thing you are. And if he can do it, you can do it. You know, you won't fall back because you don't want to lose your stature in the eyes of your buddy. And you look after your buddy looks after you. And I think that's a marvelous asset in any organization of that type. And I think all of us benefited by that. We knew that we could depend upon each other, you know. And if I got hurt, my buddy's going to see that I get pulled out or whatever, and vice versa. So, yeah, that was a wonderful part about being in the Army. And how they developed the buddy system, I don't know. But I'm sure it went back at least to the First World War. But it is a good system. And even when you got replacements in, they tried to buddy them up. They wouldn't put two replacements together. They'd put a replacement with a more experienced man, so that, you know, they could be eased into the pattern of things. if it turned out that way.
Since you made it all the way, this is my last question. This
Yeah.
is just something that popped in my head. Since you made it all the way through, did anybody, like you used to say about the lighter side of it, did people or I mean, you went through many company commanders, many
Right.
platoon lieutenants, you went through regimental commanders.
That's right.
Battalion commanders. Did you ever look around and go, I am still the only one?
Yeah. Well, I did that, but now you mention regimental commanders, and that because of my mind, Colonel Bell. You might have met his son, Raymond Bell. He's at West Point now as an instructor or something. But I never did know until just maybe 2 or 3 months before he died. But Colonel Bell, who was then, by now he's retired as a major general, his hometown is where I'm living now, Pensacola, Florida. And he was living there, and I never did know it. And I came to a reunion, and I was talking to his son, Raymond Bell. And he said, well, my dad lives in Pensacola. I said, hey, you're crazy. But he was there, and he was very well known in the retirement community of military people there. And I never did get to see him while he was still alive. I wanted to, but he died. And Ray came down, and they had a memorial service for General Bell out at the Naval Air Chapel in Pensacola Naval Air Station. And there was a big crowd of people there. But I was the only man there who served under him. And I don't know how the question arose, but well, of course Ray Bell knew me. But I think somebody asked up there, well, has anybody here served under General Bell during World War II? I said, yeah, I did. So by God, they had me get up and make some comments about General Bell at his funeral service, you know, his memorial service.
I bet that was a little unexpected.
It was unexpected, but I recall, remember we talked about shortages, the gasoline shortage and all, and we weren't getting our cigarettes and all these other goodies up there because the Red Ball, these people were stealing them and black marketing them, and he sent the delegation back to the rear echelon to bring us back our goodies, and he did. So I never...
You know, one of the, after General Bell left command of 359th, I think he got sick or something there
Yeah.
towards the end, Lieutenant Colonel Jim Spivey became your regimental commander.
I didn't know him as well, no.
You didn't know him? Yeah, I actually happened to have all of the, he was a company commander in Normandy
Yeah.
with the 358.
Oh, yeah.
And then he
I know the name, but
yeah,
I...
and then he ended up being the 3rd Battalion commander for the 358 at the Moselle River crossing.
Oh, yeah.
When Lieutenant Colonel Belkey was hit in the hand and
Yeah.
he took over. And I happened to end up working with his grandson, who we didn't know it, unbeknownst to both of us. We were both studying the division at the same time.
I'll be darned.
Because my grandfather was in the 343rd Field Artillery.
Oh, yeah.
And so we were talking, and I said, he goes, oh, I'm searching this division in World War II. I said, well, I'm in too. What are you doing? He goes, 90th. He goes, oh, I'm doing 90th. I go, well, who was your grandfather? He tells me, he goes, come to my house. He has about, literally, I would say, 200 to 250 letters that Jim Spivey wrote almost every day.
Is that right?
He was able to crank out a pen. And even in his letters, he goes, I'm having to write this, excuse the handwriting, I'm writing it in 5 minutes, I may have to go back, but I've got to drop you a line. And it's some of the most interesting reading
Yeah.
to see the progression of him talking about being a company commander and moving up, and the pride that he has in his letters by the
Right.
end of the war as a regimental commander.
Right.
And the pride is not for him as much as it is
For the
he
men.
is so proud to be commanding the men that he's
Right.
commanding. After all they've been through, he feels that there's not another division anywhere that he would want to be a commander in.
That's saying something, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. I thought it was amazing. Well, sir, it has been a
Okay, yeah, I enjoyed that.
Thank you so much.
All right.
I'm going to get this off you real quick.
Very good.